School didn't just simplify medieval history, it lied. For years, we've been told medieval people were stupid, backward, and trapped in darkness. But that version of history only exists because it's convenient. The real medieval world was structured, intelligent, and sometimes more honest than ours. And in this video, we're going to expose the truths your history class quietly skipped. If history ever felt boring or dishonest to you, you might want to subscribe. Here, we don't tell comforting stories. We tell the ones that actually happened. Chapter 1. The medieval world you were taught never existed. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. The medieval world you learned about in school, it never really existed. Most of us were taught a simple story. Medieval people were ignorant, dirty, uneducated, and terrified of everything they didn't understand. 1,000 years of human history reduced to everyone was stupid, until modern people showed up. It's a neat story, easy to remember, easy to teach, and almost completely wrong. Here's the first shocking fact most history classes never tell you. People living in the Middle Ages did not believe they were living in a dark age. That label didn't exist for them. It was invented centuries later by Renaissance scholars who wanted to make themselves look smarter and more enlightened by comparison. In other words, the idea of the Dark Ages was propaganda, not reality. Think about how strange that is. We don't usually let one era insult another and call it objective history. But somehow, medieval people got stuck with a nickname they never chose and never recognized. Another uncomfortable truth: medieval people were obsessed with learning. Not casually interested, obsessed. Universities didn't suddenly appear in the modern age. Some of the oldest universities in the world were founded in the Middle Ages. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. These weren't accidents. They were the result of a culture that deeply valued debate, logic, theology, medicine, and law. Here's where it gets even more shocking. Medieval students didn't just memorize facts. They argued constantly. Classrooms were loud, aggressive places where students were trained to challenge authority using logic. If you walked into a medieval university lecture, you wouldn't hear silence. You'd hear shouting. Now let's destroy another myth you were probably taught. Medieval people were not anti-science. In fact, much of what we now call modern science survived because medieval scholars preserved it. Ancient Greek and Roman texts weren't magically rediscovered during the Renaissance. They were copied, translated, debated, and protected for centuries by medieval scholars, especially monks and Islamic academics. Here's a fact that usually shocks people. If medieval scholars hadn't preserved ancient knowledge, the Renaissance wouldn't have happened at all. The so-called rebirth of learning relied entirely on medieval work. School often skips that part because it ruins the simple narrative. And speaking of monks, no, they weren't just chanting in dark rooms all day. Medieval monasteries were intellectual powerhouses. They ran libraries, hospitals, farms, and schools. Some monasteries functioned like small cities, complete with economic systems and long-term planning. Now let's talk about literacy. Another lie you were probably taught. Were medieval peasants all illiterate? No, Literacy rates were lower than today, obviously. But functional literacy was far more common than we're told, especially in towns. Merchants, craftsmen, and traders often needed to read contracts, keep records, and communicate across regions. A completely illiterate economy doesn't survive at medieval. Europe absolutely survived. Here's a particularly uncomfortable fact for modern audiences. Medieval people understood propaganda better than we think. Public announcements, sermons, symbols, art, and even clothing colors were used to communicate political and social messages. They didn't need smartphones to understand influence. They lived inside it, and no medieval people didn't believe the earth was flat either. This might be one of the most stubborn lies still taught today. Educated medieval Europeans knew the earth was round. They learned it from ancient sources and mathematical observation. Sailors navigated, assuming curvature. Scholars debated the size of the earth, not its shape. The medieval flat earth myth became popular in the 19th century. Long after the Middle Ages ended, once again, schools simplified history until it turned into fiction. Now here's the part that usually makes people uncomfortable. Medieval society was not chaotic. It was extremely structured. Everything had rules: food, clothing, work hours, religious obligations, even how much you were allowed to celebrate. This wasn't a lawless world, it was a world obsessed with order. Shock fact: many medieval towns had public sanitation, rules stricter than some early modern cities. Fines existed for dumping waste in the wrong place. Certain professions were required to operate outside city. Walls to reduce health risks. Was it perfect? No, but it wasn't the uncontrolled filth fantasy we're usually shown. So why were we taught something so different? Because modern history loves clean progress stories. It's comforting to believe humanity moved in a straight line from stupid to smart. The Middle Ages ruined that narrative. They show us a world that was intelligent, curious, deeply spiritual, sometimes compassionate and very human. And that's the most shocking truth of all. Medieval people were not aliens from a barbaric past. They were people like us, trapped in different systems with different limits, but often asking the same questions we still ask today. And this is just the beginning. Let me ask you something honestly. When you imagine medieval life, what do you see first? Mud, disease, people crying while working endlessly until they die at 30. That image is so common that most of us never even question it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval people didn't wake up every day thinking their lives were unbearable. In fact, many of them thought our lives would look strange, exhausting, and emotionally empty. Here's a shocking fact right away. Medieval peasants often worked fewer days per year than modern workers. I'm not joking. Between religious holidays, feast days, and seasonal agricultural cycles, large parts of the year were not spent in non-stop labor. Some estimates suggest medieval laborers had well over 100 days off annually. That's more than most people today. Now, before you get jealous, yes, their work was physically harder, but it wasn't the endless grind we imagine. Life followed rhythms. Seasons mattered. Time mattered. Rest was built into the system, not treated like a luxury. Another myth school loves to repeat is that medieval people lived joyless, colorless lives. This one is especially wrong. Medieval towns were loud, colorful, and constantly social. Music wasn't rare. Dancing wasn't forbidden. Festivals weren't occasional, they were frequent. Entire towns would shut down for celebrations, processions, and religious events that blurred the line between sacred and fun. Here's a fact that surprises a lot of people. Medieval people laughed at crude jokes. A lot. Surviving manuscripts are full of humor, satire, dirty jokes, and sarcasm. This wasn't a humorless society terrified of sin every second. They knew how to laugh often at things we'd still laugh at today. Now let's talk about death, because this is where school really messes up the story. Yes, death was more visible in the Middle Ages. People died younger on average. Disease existed. But here's the shocking twist. Medieval people were not constantly paralyzed by fear of death. They talked about it openly. They joked about it. They planned for it. Death wasn't hidden behind hospital walls. It was part of daily life. Modern society hides death so well that we panic when reminded of it. Medieval society did the opposite. And psychologically, that actually made many people more resilient, not less. Another lie you were probably taught. Marriage in the Middle Ages was always forced and loveless. Was that true sometimes? Yes, but not always and not even most of the time for common people. Many marriages among peasants were based on mutual agreement, affection, and shared survival. Love letters from the Middle Ages still exist. Emotional attachment wasn't invented in the 18th century. Here's a shocking detail school rarely mentions. Medieval women had more economic independence than women in some later periods. Especially in towns, women ran businesses, worked as brewers, merchants, textile producers, and shop owners. In some places, widows had full legal rights to inherit and manage property. In fact, women brewers were so common that brewing was considered women's work, until it became profitable. Then, suddenly, history books got quieter about women's role in it. Now let's talk hygiene, because this is probably the biggest lie of all. No, medieval people did not believe bathing was evil. No, they did not think dirt was holy. Public bathhouses existed in medieval cities. People washed. They used soap. They cared about cleanliness, not just for health, but for social reasons. Smelling bad was embarrassing, and yes, even poor people tried to stay clean when they could. The idea that medieval people never bathed comes mostly from later periods that actually bathed less due to fear of disease spreading through water. History flipped the blame, and school never corrected it. And food, oh, this one hurts modern pride. Medieval people did not eat bland food. They loved spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These weren't exotic novelties for royalty only. Spices were expensive, yes, but they were used intentionally and creatively. Medieval cookbooks survive, and many recipes are shockingly complex. Here's a detail that usually shocks people. Medieval people cared deeply about flavor balance, presentation, and symbolism in food. Meals weren't just calories, they were culture, So why does school paint medieval life as constant suffering? Because it's easier to teach a tragedy than a system. It's easier to say life was miserable than to explain how people adapted, survived, celebrated, and found meaning inside limitations. And that's the truth most textbooks avoid. Medieval life wasn't worse than modern life. It was constrained in different ways. Some things were harder. Some things were simpler. Some things were arguably better. And once you see that, it becomes very uncomfortable to keep calling them primitive. And we're still just warming up. Let's be honest. When someone says medieval medicine, you probably picture a guy with no medical training holding a rusty knife, shouting something about demons and then sawing off a limb. And yes, sometimes things really were that bad. But here's the part school rarely explains. Medieval medicine was not random, and it wasn't built on pure superstition. In fact, medieval doctors followed medical theories that had survived for over 1,000 years. They studied texts from Hippocrates, Galen, and Arabic physicians whose medical knowledge was far ahead of Europe at the time. Medicine wasn't guesswork, it was theory-driven. The problem was that some of those theories were wrong. Here's your first shock fact. Bloodletting wasn't considered madness. It was considered logical. Doctors believed the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, in their view, came from imbalance. So removing blood wasn't cruelty, it was correction. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes it actually helped, especially in cases involving high blood pressure or inflammation. Now, let's talk about surgery, because this is where modern people usually laugh. Medieval surgeons didn't have anesthesia the way we know it, but they did use pain-reducing substances: alcohol, opium, herbal mixtures. They also understood something incredibly important. Speed mattered. Surgeons trained to work fast, not because they were careless, but because pain and shock killed people. Here is a shocking detail that almost never gets mentioned. Some medieval surgical survival rates were surprisingly high, especially for procedures like amputations after battlefield injuries. Why? Because surgeons focused on clean cuts, cauterization, and aftercare, even if they didn't fully understand bacteria. And speaking of bacteria, no medieval doctors didn't know germs existed. But here's the twist. Many medieval medical practices accidentally reduced infection. Honey was used on wounds, and modern science now confirms honey has antibacterial properties. Wine was used to clean wounds, which helped sterilize them. Moldy bread was sometimes applied unknowingly, introducing early antibiotic effects. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew that it worked. Another lie school tells is that medieval hospitals were places you went to die. Some were, yes, but many medieval hospitals focused on care, not cure. They provided food, warmth, cleanliness, and rest, which, in an era without advanced medicine, actually saved lives. Recovery often depended more on environment than intervention. Here's a fact that shocks a lot of people. Medieval hospitals were often cleaner than early modern hospitals. When medical science advanced but sanitation lagged, death rates actually went up for a time. Progress isn't always a straight line. Now let's talk about plague. Because this is where medieval medicine gets blamed the hardest. Did medieval doctors understand the Black Death? No. But here's the shocking part. Some medieval responses to plague were surprisingly effective. Quarantine was not a modern invention. Cities isolated ships, restricted movement, shut gates, even created early forms of public health regulations. The word quarantine itself comes from the medieval Italian quaranta giorni, 40 days. That's not ignorance. That's organized response. Another uncomfortable truth. Medieval people noticed patterns in disease spread. They observed that crowded areas suffered more, that certain trades were riskier. That isolation helped. They lacked microscopes, but they were not blind. Another myth, medieval trials were completely unfair. Not exactly. Medieval courts used witnesses, oaths, written records, and legal professionals. Many towns had written law codes. Judges weren't just guessing, they followed procedures. Here's a fact that shocks a lot of modern viewers. You could win a case against a noble if you had evidence. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible either. Law wasn't purely about class, it was about status. Yes, but also about proof and community reputation. Now let's talk about the thing everyone loves to mock. Trial by ordeal. You've probably heard of it holding hot iron, being thrown into water, that kind of thing. Sounds insane, right? But here's the part school never tells you. Trial by ordeal wasn't about the test, it was about the community. Most people never even reached the ordeal. Cases were usually resolved before it happened. The threat of divine judgment pushed people to confess, negotiate, or settle. And when ordeals did occur, they were often rigged in subtle ways to produce survivable outcomes. Yes, seriously. For example, water temperatures varied. Hot iron wounds were examined days later, not immediately. Priests oversaw the process. The goal wasn't random death, it was resolution. Another shocking detail. Trial by ordeal declined because medieval people themselves criticized it. It wasn't abolished by modern enlightenment. It faded because medieval thinkers argued it was unreliable and open to abuse. Now let's talk about crime itself. Medieval society didn't treat crime as the state versus the individual. It treated it as a disruption of community balance. That's why fines, compensation, and reconciliation were common punishments. Jail wasn't the default option, and here's the shock of prison was rare because it was expensive and inefficient. Locking someone up meant feeding them. Medieval towns didn't want that cost. So instead, criminals paid fines, worked off debts, or were banished. Banishment, by the way, was often worse than prison. Losing your community meant losing protection, identity, and survival. Now here's where medieval justice gets darker. Punishments varied wildly depending on who you were. Gender, age, status all mattered. A noble and a peasant committing the same crime could face very different outcomes. And unlike modern systems that claim neutrality, medieval justice admitted this openly. Here's a fact that usually shocks people. Children were legally punished, sometimes severely. The idea of childhood innocence as we understand it today didn't fully exist. Kids were expected to learn responsibility early, sometimes brutally early. So was medieval justice fair? By modern standards, no. By medieval standards, often yes. And that's the key thing. School doesn't prepare you for. You can't judge medieval systems using modern expectations without losing the plot. They weren't trying to build a future democracy. They were trying to stop chaos. And sometimes they succeeded. And we're not done yet. Let me say this carefully, because this is where history classes usually either oversimplify or stay quiet. Medieval people were religious, yes, deeply religious, but they were not mindless believers who accepted everything without question. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't just about faith, it was about structure, control, comfort, fear, and community all at the same time. Here's a shocking fact to start with. Medieval people argued about religion constantly. They questioned interpretations, debated doctrine, and challenged authority, sometimes publicly. Heresy trials didn't exist because everyone agreed. They existed because disagreement was common. Now, let's clear up one of the biggest lies school tells. No, medieval people did not believe everything bad was caused by demons. Illness, famine, and disasters were often explained through natural causes and spiritual ones at the same time. Medieval thinking wasn't binary. It didn't force people to choose between faith or reason. They used both. Here's something that surprises modern audiences. Many medieval priests were highly educated intellectuals. Some were philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and political thinkers. The church wasn't just a religious institution. It was one of the largest educational systems in the world at the time. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Religion also controlled daily life in ways modern people rarely imagine. What you ate, when you worked, when you rested, how you married, even when you were allowed to have sex. Religious calendars structured entire societies. Shock fact, nearly one of the medieval calendar was made up of religious feast days or restrictions. This meant frequent rest days, but also frequent rules. You couldn't just live however you wanted. Life was scheduled by belief. Now, let's talk about fear, because fear was a tool. Hell wasn't just a theological concept. It was a social regulator. Sermons vividly described punishment after death, not just to scare people, but to shape behavior. And it worked. Shame and fear were cheaper than armies. But here's the part school avoids. Medieval people were not passive victims of religious fear. They negotiated it. They bent rules. They joked about priests. Satirical texts mocking the church were popular and widely circulated. People knew when religion was being used for power. Now let's talk about indulgences, because this one always gets simplified. Indulgences were not originally pay money. Get into heaven, they were tied to acts of devotion. Over time, corruption crept in. Money changed hands. And medieval people noticed. Shock fact: criticism of church. Corruption existed centuries before the Protestant Reformation. Ordinary people complained. Writers mocked greed. Even clergy condemned abuse. The idea that everyone blindly accepted corruption is simply false. And then there's the Inquisition, the word everyone shudders at. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The medieval Inquisition was more bureaucratic than chaotic. Records were kept. Procedures existed. Evidence mattered sometimes more than later, witch trials in the early modern period, which were actually deadlier. That doesn't make it humane, but it does make it organized. And here's a fact that often shocks people. The most intense witch hunts did not happen in the Middle Ages. They peaked later, during periods we often call more enlightened. History really doesn't like neat narratives. Religion also offered something modern people often underestimate: psychological stability. When life was unpredictable, belief systems provided meaning. Suffering wasn't random, it had purpose. That mattered deeply. So was medieval religion oppressive? Yes, sometimes brutally so. Was it also supportive, educational, and unifying? Also yes, and that's the part school struggles to explain. Because it's easier to paint religion as pure ignorance than as a powerful system that shaped human behavior, for better and worse. And once you understand that, medieval society stops looking stupid and starts looking dangerously effective. Let me guess. When you think about medieval war, you picture non-stop chaos, knights swinging swords wildly, armies crashing into each other without strategy, people killing just because they could. Basically, barbarism. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval violence was rarely random. In many cases, it was planned, and tightly controlled, not because medieval people were kinder, but because violence was expensive. First shock fact: most medieval battles were avoided on purpose. Yes, seriously. Armies spent more time threatening, negotiating, posturing, and intimidating than actually fighting. Why? Because trained soldiers were valuable. Equipment was costly, and death weakened economies. A single lost battle could bankrupt a lord. So instead of charging immediately, medieval armies tried everything else first. Another thing school doesn't emphasize: medieval warfare followed rules. Not moral rules, practical ones. There were expectations about ransom, surrender, and treatment of certain prisoners. Knights were often captured, not killed, because they were worth money. Shock fact: being captured as a knight was sometimes better than winning. If you were taken prisoner, your family could ransom you back. that ransom could enrich your captor without further bloodshed. Killing you would have been bad business. Now let's talk about knights, because movies lie a lot here. No, knights weren't reckless superheroes. They were trained professionals, often starting from childhood. Horsemanship, weapons, discipline, all drilled constantly. This wasn't fantasy combat. It was muscle memory. And here's something that surprises people. Knights avoided unnecessary killing, not because they were merciful, but because reputation mattered. A knight known for slaughter could be denied ransom, alliances, or future cooperation. Violence was political. Now, don't misunderstand me. Medieval warfare was still brutal. Raids, sieges, and civilian suffering were very real. But even then, sieges were preferred over open battle. Starve the enemy, wait them out, force surrender, less risk, more control. Shock fact, most medieval cities fell without a final assault. They surrendered once food ran out. Assaults were last resorts because they destroyed infrastructure, and no ruler wanted to inherit rubble. Now let's talk about armor, because school and movies love to get this wrong. No, medieval armor was not heavy, clumsy, or useless. A trained knight could run, mount a horse, and fight effectively in full plate. Armor evolved constantly in response to weapons. It wasn't decorative, it was engineering. Here's a detail that shocks modern audiences. Many medieval soldiers survived wounds that would kill people in earlier periods. Armor reduced lethality. Blows injured instead of killed. Again, violence was being managed. Now let's address something uncomfortable. Medieval people were not shocked by violence the way we are. They didn't panic at blood. They didn't collapse at the sight of death. Exposure created psychological adaptation, not apathy, but resilience. And here's the twist, that didn't make them cruel monsters. It made them practical. Modern societies outsource violence to distant systems. Armies, police, screens. Medieval societies faced it directly, which forced them to control it socially. Now, let's talk about tournaments, because they weren't games. Tournaments were training, display, politics, and controlled violence combined. Knights practiced combat under rules that reduced death while still proving skill. Injuries happened. Death sometimes happened. But again, structure mattered. Shock fact. Tournaments were sometimes deadlier than real battles. Why? Because pride replaced strategy. Now here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Medieval people accepted violence as part of life, but they didn't glorify it endlessly. Chroniclers often describe war as tragic, wasteful, and morally dangerous. The idea that medieval culture loved bloodshed is exaggerated. Violence was tolerated, not celebrated. So why does school teach medieval war as pure savagery? Because it makes modern warfare feel cleaner by comparison. It lets us pretend we've evolved past brutality, even while we've perfected it technologically. And that's the shocking truth most textbooks avoid. Medieval violence was limited by human effort, cost, and proximity. Modern violence isn't, and that should make us uncomfortable. Let me ask you something personal. When you think about childhood, what comes to mind? Protection, innocence, gradual learning, a long, safe runway before adulthood. Now forget all of that, because medieval childhood worked on a completely different timeline. Here's the first shocking fact. Medieval people did not think childhood lasted very long. Childhood wasn't a protected emotional state. It was a preparation phase. If you survived infancy, society expected you to start learning your role quickly. And yes, children played. They laughed. They made toys. Archaeologists have found dolls, spinning tops, balls, and board games. Medieval kids were not born serious, but society didn't revolve around preserving their innocence. Another uncomfortable truth school rarely mentions: medieval parents loved their children deeply. The idea that medieval people didn't emotionally bond with their kids because death rates were high is largely false. Letters, prayers, and records show grief that is unmistakably real. But here's the shock. Love did not equal protection. Children worked early. Farm work, apprenticeships, domestic labor, often starting around age 7. Not because parents were cruel, but because survival required contribution. And apprenticeships, they weren't casual. Shock fact: some medieval children lived away from their families by age 10. Apprentices were sent to other households to learn trades. This wasn't abandonment, it was investment. Skills mattered more than comfort. Now let's talk about education, because this part really breaks the stereotype. No, medieval children weren't all uneducated. Basic education existed, especially in towns. Reading, counting, religious instruction, these were common. Not universal, but common enough to matter. Here's a detail that shocks people. Girls were often educated alongside boys at basic levels. Literacy wasn't seen as dangerous for women. That fear developed later. Many medieval women could read, write, and manage accounts. Now let's address discipline, because this is where modern audiences get uncomfortable. Corporal punishment existed. It was accepted, and it was not limited to children. Adults were punished physically too. Pain was a teaching tool, not because medieval people enjoyed it, but because it was effective and immediate. Shock fact: medieval societies believed emotional damage was less dangerous than disorder. Stability came first. Feelings came second. Now here's something school almost never talks about. Medieval children were exposed to adult realities very. Early death, violence, sexuality, religion, nothing was hidden behind. Age-appropriate filters. Did that traumatize them? Sometimes. Did it also make them psychologically resilient? Often. Modern childhood extends vulnerability. Medieval childhood shortened it. Another shocking detail: teenagers were considered adults. Marriage in the mid to late teens was normal, especially for girls. This wasn't seen as abuse, it was seen as timing. And yes, by modern standards, that makes us deeply uncomfortable. It should. But here's the important part. You cannot understand medieval society if you impose modern emotional expectations on it. They optimized for survival, continuity, and order, not personal fulfillment. And that leads us to one final uncomfortable truth. Medieval childhood wasn't cruel by medieval standards. It was honest. It prepared people for the world they actually lived in, not the world we wish they had. And that honesty shaped adults who could endure famine, war, disease, and loss because they were trained from the beginning to face reality, not avoid it, and now we're at the end. Let's end with the lie that started everything. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were not a 1,000-year mistake between two better eras. And medieval people were not waiting to be rescued by modern intelligence. That story is comforting, but it's fiction. Here's the final shocking fact. The idea of continuous human progress is one of the most misleading myths we believe. History doesn't move in straight lines. It loops, stumbles, adapts, and sometimes forgets what it once knew. The Middle Ages weren't a collapse of intelligence, they were a transformation of priorities. Survival mattered, order mattered, meaning mattered, and those priorities shaped systems that worked for the world they lived in. What school rarely teaches is this. Modern society inherited more from the Middle Ages than it likes to admit. Universities, legal frameworks, medical institutions, work schedules, even the concept of structured time. None of these suddenly appeared out of nowhere. We didn't escape the medieval world. We built on top of it. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. When we laugh at medieval people for believing in authority, ritual, and structure, we ignore how deeply we still rely on the same things. We just changed the symbols. We trust systems we don't fully understand. We obey rules written by distant authorities. We follow narratives because they make life feel stable. Sound familiar? Another uncomfortable truth. Medieval people were painfully aware of their limitations. They knew they didn't know everything. They accepted uncertainty. Modern people often assume we've solved most problems until something breaks. Plagues, wars, social collapse. History keeps reminding us that progress is fragile. Here's the final shock. Future generations will probably look at us the same way we look at medieval people. They'll laugh at our confidence. They'll criticize our blind spots. They'll simplify our complexity into stereotypes that feel unfair, just like we've done, and maybe that's the real lesson school avoids. Now, medieval people loved, feared, thought, planned, lied, learned, argued, laughed. They live-ed inside systems that made sense to them, just like we do now. And once you see that, the phrase Dark Ages stops making sense. Because darkness isn't about technology. It's about misunderstanding the people who came before us. And the moment we stop dismissing them as stupid, history stops being boring. If this video changed even one thing you thought you knew about the Middle Ages, then history just did its job.